The report is entitled Unhealthy Silence, which is trying to understand how the development banks have been behaving during this chat. And it is unhealthy in that it has fueled inaction or retaliation during this challenging time of COVID-19 pandemic. This report is key as it traces the footprints of development banks towards financing different regimes across the globe, and how they've performed in terms of promoting human rights. In other terms, is it fueling the attacks or is it fueling the ending of the pandemic? This funding, where exactly is it headed? My name is Tavani Moyo. I am here representing IFEX, where I'm a board member. I'm equally joined with the highly competent panel, which is comprising of three key panelists. Hannah Story, there is Farouk Faisal, and there is Evelyn Blanck. Farouk Faisal is the regional director for Article 19, that is in Bangladesh and Southern Asia. Article 19 is a non-governmental organization focusing on the right of freedom of expression, access to information, that works on the world to ensure that everyone, everywhere, expresses freely. Evelyn Blanck is a journalist and director for Centro, Cívitas, an organization that works to protect journalists in Guatemala. While Hannah Story leads the business and human rights focus work at Frontline Defenders, and she also works part-time on the Defenders in Development campaign at the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. Ladies and gentlemen, he or she, this is the panel that will be taking us through today's launch, wherein we are dealing with these complex matters. You might be wondering why the background behind us. This is to represent the journalists or persons who could not join us on these platforms. Either they are no longer on this world, they are now deceased, or they are in isolation, or they are in hiding, or they are performing other duties outside the glaring of the global sphere. In this regard, please let's take a moment of silence in recognizing these critical players in the expression. Thank you very much. I will then jump straight into our conversations. To start the conversation, I'll ask Hannah to help us in unpacking this report. Hannah, what are the key issues that are emerging from this report? What do you find striking about the role of development banks in this whole pandemic era?
Thank you very much, Tabani. As you kindly introduced me already, but my name is Hannah Story, and although I do work for Frontline Defenders, I will be speaking on behalf of the Defenders in Development campaign today, which is a campaign to hold the development banks to account on issues concerning human rights defenders. As Tabani mentioned, this report, Unhealthy Silence, which I'll be presenting today, is a joint collaboration between the Coalition for Human Rights in Development, IFEX, and Article 19. And special thanks also go to Frontline Defenders and the Committee to Protect Journalists, who also contributed to the report. So in 2020, many of you may remember Li Wenliang, a 34-year-old doctor in Wuhan, China, who first detected and warned people about this new virus, which looked a bit like SARS. Li was prevented from speaking out. His warnings were discredited, and well, the rest is history. The virus spread, and sadly, Li died from COVID in early February 2020. During the pandemic, human rights defenders, journalists, and healthcare workers like Li have courageously continued to raise their voices to demand an effective response to COVID-19. They have provided life-saving information. They have called for equal access to healthcare, for protective equipment for frontline workers, for a transparent and equitable distribution of vaccines, and for financial support to face the economic impact of the pandemic. In turn, international finance institutions around the world have played a crucial role in funding and shaping the response to the pandemic. They have funded everything from the development of containment measures and quarantine, supporting the purchase of healthcare equipment and PPE and vaccine rollouts, to financial support to sectors which are impacted by lockdowns. They've also funded awareness raising and risk communication about COVID-19. And as of mid-June, international finance institutions had earmarked over $150 billion to finance responses to the pandemic. Now, development banks have a responsibility to respect human rights under international law, but also the government shareholders of these institutions have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. As stated by the UN independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, states are not allowed to deploy IFIs to violate international law when they cannot do so in their own capacity as individual states. Such delegation cannot be used to avoid responsibility. Further to this, in their environmental and social policies, most development banks recognize the principle of participation and require processes for engaging different stakeholders in order to ensure that any potential human rights or environmental impacts are noted and addressed. Many development banks have also committed to zero tolerance of reprisals against those who share their views about bank finance projects. However, when we were researching for this report, we gathered data showing at least 335 people who have suffered reprisals for criticizing the state response to the pandemic in a total of 35 countries that have received financial support from development banks for their COVID response. And this is likely a significant underestimate. This report details 8 emblematic cases where human rights defenders, healthcare workers, and journalists have faced retaliation for speaking out about development bank-funded COVID-19 response projects, and those development banks have failed to act. These cases are from Bangladesh, China, Guatemala, Guinea, Jordan, Nicaragua, Sudan, and Uzbekistan. And we'll hear a bit more about those cases today during the launch, so I won't go into too much detail here, but it's important to say that many of these cases have happened in the context of strong restrictions on civic space, where although development banks have committed to undertaking stakeholder engagement, they have not done enough to ensure that people can raise their voices safely. Ironically, in many of these countries, where human rights defenders, journalists, and healthcare workers have faced reprisals for sharing information about the pandemic, development banks are funding projects which include awareness raising and risk communication about the pandemic. So they clearly recognize the importance of accurate and widespread public information. Despite this, and despite commitments and the responsibilities of development banks, they have failed to act. We and many other organizations have raised many cases similar to those that are in this report, but unfortunately the banks have not been very responsive. Although we've managed to arrange some meetings and we did get some responses to letters, their responses have been quite disappointing and lack decisive action. So to sum up, what are we asking for the banks to do, the development banks to do? Well, we think that it comes down to three key areas. Firstly, take a preventative approach. So don't just respond to reprisals when they happen, but implement policies and procedures which ensure risk of retaliation are addressed in the design of the project and throughout the life cycle of the project. Secondly, respond effectively to reprisals. So when they do occur, there needs to be a protocol in place for how the banks are going to handle those allegations of reprisals. And finally, we want them to make public commitments. So to publicly condemn reprisals and publicly commit to the promotion and protection of press freedom and civic space, to make clear to us all that they are serious about tackling this issue and upholding their commitments. Thanks, Tabani, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. A highly informative summary. I think I will take my next panelist and see how the discussion unfolds. especially with the chat box, which I encourage our panelists and attendees to keep a close eye on in terms of contributions from the floor. I'll then request Farouk, what are the freedom of expression issues that you saw emerging in this age of the pandemic in your involvement with the report, Farouk?
Thank you very much, Tabani, and thank you, Coalition for Human Rights and Development, and thank you for involving Article 19 in this initiative. As you know, that Article 19 monitors the freedom of expression issue all over the world. My responsibility is for South Asia, and at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, we were concerned internationally that this kind of reprisal can come upon journalists and whistleblowers and freedom of expression practitioners. So we came out with recommendations for the government, for the media, for the online platform owners, and everybody in March 2020. And as part of my work, I was observing all the South Asian countries and what was happening there, especially in Bangladesh, because I am in Bangladesh now. And Bangladesh has a Digital Security Act, which is a draconian act, and that's used against anyone who writes anything online which is dissenting the government decisions. And especially yesterday, Amnesty International released a report on no space for dissent in Bangladesh, and special rapporteur on freedom of expression, Irene Khan, was speaking there, and they said that in last year, 433 people were arrested under the Digital Security Act, and among them, 185 were journalists in Bangladesh. So Digital Security Act is used left and right. We also noticed in India, this kind of operation was happening on social communicator and media activists, especially in area like Kashmir. In Sri Lanka, a Muslim lawyer is still in jail. And again, the government is very handling it heavy-handed. And in Pakistan, we took Pakistan as an example to write to the international development institutions about the misuse of the fund and of operation of the journalists, and we did that. And Nepal and Maldives are not any different in that sense. So in whole South Asia, notice that during COVID-19, there was a whole pressure, especially on the frontline defender, doctors and nurses, not to talk to the journalists. And journalists or cartoonists were arrested, journalists were arrested, and even singers were arrested under this law. So there was a big operation, and government took this excuse of COVID-19, national security, etc., and misused any power they hold. And all the governments, though they claim to be democratically elected, actually behaving like authoritarian governments in this continent in South Asia. Thank you, Tabani.
Thanks for what you said, picture. And in your engagement, what did the development banks do? Was there any meaningful response to this crackdown and reprisals that befell Bangladesh and the South Asia community?
Yeah, when we were monitoring the situation anyway, but when we got involved with the coalition, and then we looked at the countries where there has been attacks against media outlets, journalists, because of the reporting on COVID-19, or restriction on media freedom because of legislation related to COVID-19, countries where there are specific cases that can be emblematic, and countries where the safety of journalists is already a problem and where we can prove that COVID-19 has exacerbated an existing problem. So we decided to pick up Pakistan as an example, and on behalf of our Pakistani civil society and organizations, Article 19 wrote 3 letters to World Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, And we raised the issue and context, and we gave specific examples of the cases. And we put bank loans links on this with these cases, and then we asked some questions. And the reply that we got were totally vague, and they did not answer the questions that we were asking. So we again send a second letter to all these three organizations and haven't heard back from them. So it was totally vague. These are not answers that we are looking for. So we got reply, but very vaguely, which was not useful for our purposes. Thank you.
Wow, what a sad situation. We hope at the end of this conversation, we'll be drifting towards more concrete actions towards holding developmental banks accountable, especially towards defending expression annexed to the funding that they give to various member states. My next panelist, or the last panelist, Evelyn Blanck, Guatemala as a case study. What were the key issues that you experienced pertaining to the role of development banks and the issues of expression and how they responded to the same?
Bien. Buen día, muchas gracias.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the space. I'm going to present the case of Anastasia Mejia. She's a journalist. Guatemala is a country with the state infiltrated by mafias. There's organized crime, and there is corruption and impunity. It is a country where violence is institutionalized and where international support to combat corruption and the existence of illegal and clandestine security forces have been and are being rejected. There's a journalist in exile. In Guatemala, in this framework, we have to say that it is risky to practice journalism according to the report of Reporters Without Borders. In Guatemala, regulatory frameworks restrict freedom of expression. Community communicators are persecuted by the state. The press is attacked from the highest spheres of power, especially independent investigative journalists. This situation and the denial of information have worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic, and cases of criminalization of journalists have increased. Anastasia Mejia Tiriquiz is an indigenous leader representing the Mayan Quiche ethnic group, defender of women's rights, social communicator, and journalist. She has contributed a lot in the cultural sphere, disseminating and preserving local customs and practices. She directs Xolabaj Radio and Xolabaj TV. Ms. Mejia is also recognized for her public work in monitoring and denouncing acts of corruption and embezzlement of the municipal administration where she lives. On August 23, 2020, representatives of the Merchants Association met with her and asked her to cover the delivery of a memorial to the local mayor, Florencio Calascosa, who has been who's going to be asked about his acts around COVID-19. She comes to this memorial, and then a group of unarmed people starts to break into the site where the memorial was taking place. They looted and partially set fire in the building. And it is possible to hear in a video audio how she comments that despite Carrascosa being a very questioned mayor, this type of actions was deplorable. Later on, several agents of the civil police show at her residence, arrest her, and indicate that she was accused with sedition. She's arrested in a prison outside her community, and she's detained there for 36 days. All her rights are violated, her legal guarantees. She's in insecurity situation. She has no access to medication, and she feels very alone. because she's uncommunicated. She didn't know that dozens of people, amongst them the organization I represent, were working to free her from prison. Then the hearing comes. Mejia was finally heard in court, but the judge and the prosecutor obviously are in complicity with the corrupt powers with Mayor Carrascosa, and she's not freed, but she's sent to home arrest after paying around $2,600, which journalists from Guatemala collect so that she could be released and go home. She's in home right now, Anastasia Mejia, living with her aggressor, who's still hindering her work and not giving her money for her projects. Anastasia Mejia told me for this event these words: if money given by the development banks is used for reprisal against population and not for development, then we don't want it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Evelyn. In this harrowing experience in Guatemala, why then should we concerned with expression? Why is it important for the banks to link expression to their funding? Why exactly?
Bueno, en el último año y medio hemos vivido.
In the last year, we have lived as a humanity a situation that has no precedent, and if it has something showed us, is the importance of freedom of expression. In the first days, when we all saw ourselves limited in this situation, and with the days that went by, many people in cities, they went outside their balconies, playing music, outside with signs, making music. And this showed us the importance of this freedom, because we look for 1,000 ways of expressing ourselves, to say that we're here with you. It is part of human dignity, and emphasizing on this function of facilitation of freedom of expression to help make realize other rights like health. We cannot deny their fundamental role. So people receive knowledge, information about an illness that we are starting from zero because we have no knowledge about it. And it is very important because so we can have the certainty to continue existing as a humanity. And this knowledge is a pattern, is from the humanity, and it is very important for survival for all people that have a right to know and apply it to save their lives. In countries like Guatemala, the pandemic has made the vulnerability higher, and citizens are being hurt, and their voices have to be heard. And that is why it is so important to have an independent press that gives information that is transparent. We want to highlight the freedom of expression and cultural rights of communities, not only because of their right to opinion, but also the right to give knowledge from ancestral knowledge. That collection of voices, of informations, of giving knowledge. The scenery would be very sad of only few actors with authority and deciding for everybody. That would be a very sad scenario of opacity and death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I will then jump back to Hannah and say, Hannah, what will be your response if a bank then says to you, well, it's not my right, it's not my duty or responsibility to defend expression. Maybe it's the role of political actors. What do you say to that? And probably tied to that is what are the next steps after the launch of this report?
Thank you, Tabani. It's a good question, one we probably hear quite a lot. Unfortunately, you cannot divorce civic space from the Blanck projects. Poor press freedom, poor civic space directly impacts the effectiveness of a project because people are just unable to raise concerns about negative impacts or poor performance of a project. So one of the cases in the report from Nicaragua, where a number of doctors and healthcare professionals, they were complaining about the government's response to the pandemic. So highlighting the underreporting of figures, failures to implement remote working, keeping borders open, causing pressure on the healthcare system, and they were fired. And this is despite the fact that they could directly see these impacts, and if that could have been fed back to the banks, the project could have been made more successful at handling the pandemic. So I think it's a good example of why they need to be listening, but also in some contexts, people cannot raise their voices at all because civic space is so limited. So this is a case where a reprisal has happened. Maybe in the future, they'd be less likely to come forward. But in some cases, it's so closed that people aren't coming forward at all. And the banks, there's the two levels. One, they're not listening when they are coming forward. They're not really monitoring or they don't seem to be. And one is, when people can't come forward at all. And really, if the banks want their projects to be effective, then they need to be listening to people. And they know this. They've made really strong commitments around stakeholder engagement. So they have studies which show this as well. So we're not telling them anything that's new. In terms of next steps, we have quite a large advocacy campaign planned around this, where we're going to be speaking to banks, we're going to be speaking to their government shareholders. And if anybody on this call from other NGOs is interested in getting involved in that, I really encourage you to get in touch with me. I'll pop my email in the chats because we really want this to be a collective effort. This is something that's impacted, so many different groups: human rights defenders, journalists, healthcare workers. There are so many of us working with these communities, or who are these communities who could be raising this concern. So yeah, do get in touch. Thanks, Tabani.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. I think this was quite elaborate. There's a question from the chat box. Ekan, if I pronounced it correctly, asks Evelyn, which other strategies do you think you can employ to defend rights of people, such as the case you just presented? Evelyn?
Sí, muchas gracias. Para nosotros,
yeah, thank you for the question. For us, it was very important to have alliances with international organizations, so these cases are not only debated or known in the country or in the region, but also on a global level. Because at the end of the day, these are cases that represent many other cases that are taking place. And these authorities, the authorities that exist in our countries, do have attention on, pay attention to international voices. The reprisal against Anastasia, for example, has been considered. For example, not long ago, a couple of days ago, they were considering to remove her home arrest because she feels more protected. So the international arena is very important, of course, and also us inside the country, we're going to strengthen our civil organization alliances, and because we are very weak against this authoritarian attack.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I hope you are answered, Ekan. My other question will quickly jump back to Farouk. Someone might ask, why are you after the banks and not the governments? Why focus on the banks?
The banks actually providing the government the opportunity to be oppressive. So because the bank gives money to the government, and the government is also involved in corruption, and when you raise the voice against the corruption involved in COVID-19 issues or vaccination issues, it has to be raised. But the bank money the government uses to stop these voices. And we believe at Article 19 that information can save life during this pandemic time. And this government in Bangladesh arrested whistleblower who started saying that there are COVID affected people before government accepted the reality that we have COVID in Bangladesh. So those people are actually trying to save life. So World Bank's money, if it is used to oppress or stop the voices and shrink the civic space, then they're actually not saving life. Actually, they're helping to people to die in this COVID time. So going after government, yes, we are going after government, but we also want to address the source of the power, which is monetary power, that's coming from outside, who are obligated and committed to follow the human rights principles and the well-being of the citizens of the countries that they're giving the money. So that's why we're after banks.
Thanks, Farouk. Quite a strong approach, and indeed the right to choice of banking and expression intertwined, equally accountability, an issue that need to be attended to. I think there's a question from Edie, and I think my colleagues, you have seen the question. I'm trying to scroll through. If you have noted the question, please jump through.
Hi, Tabani. There was a question in the Q&A box from Ed O'Donovan. He's saying, I think if I click answer live, then people can see it. I can see from the stats that nearly a full third of documented cases come from only 2 countries, Morocco and Thailand. Any thoughts on why there have been such high incidence of reprisals in these 2 countries? Well, the first thing to say is it's really just a case of the methodology. We had organizations that were particularly focused on those countries, documenting those cases closely, and we're very much sure that this is an underrepresentation of the number of cases and just really a sample to show what's going on around the world. Particularly given that in the most repressive regimes, we expect there are many cases that we're not hearing about. I don't know if Dalile, who is the author of the report, might want to come in at this point and add to what I've just said there.
Dalile, can you come through, please? While Dalile is trying to connect, I understand there are also 2 hands raised, David and Maro. If they can then just shoot through the questions, and we attend to the panelists who then attend to the questions. Thank you. David. Struggling to connect. Maro Joe. Again, it seems there's a connectivity challenge. If you can also utilize the Q&A to articulate the questions, that will be quite appreciated. I see Joy The IFIs are taking the opportunity of weak policies of developing countries and justifying their misdeeds. Even after if any project cancelled, they did not cancel taking the interest from the project. From my panelists present here, feel free to jump in on the question. I see Maro says the hand was a mistake, but okay, let's attend to Joy's question.
Hi, I can come in if I'm fully understanding the question, Joy. Feel free to jump in if I'm not. I think you're right, and unfortunately, you know, we need to be holding these development banks to account for both their own policies, which are stronger than many of the countries and clients that they're working with, but also to, you know, international human rights standards, which they have an obligation to work in accordance with. And I think you're right. I think your point there about after a project is cancelled is really key. So one thing that we're very much asking with what I mentioned earlier about taking a preventative approach is really to undertake human rights due diligence ahead of a project being implemented, so that they can really assess and identify risks of reprisals early on at the beginning of a project, and then hopefully not continue or adapt the project itself to address those risks of reprisals. So it's not a case of them starting a project and then finding out about reprisals and then cancelling it. It should be a case of really preventing those reprisals at that early stage. But apologies if I've misunderstood your question, Joy. Feel free to clarify if I have.
Thanks, Hannah. I hope, Joy, you have been answered. If you still need further clarification, please indicate. David, I understand you still need to ask a question. I think the controls have been lifted. If you still need to ask a question, please do so.
It's David Christopher here from IFEX. I didn't have my hand up, but I was wondering if the panel could speak to, there's an interesting section in the recommendations about what the governments who are the shareholders of these development banks, the kind of role they could play potentially. And I was wondering if the panel could speak to that.
Thanks, David. Panelists, this question probably you can take a dive, but the three of you will be key in addressing it.
Bueno, si me permiten,
if you allow me, give my opinion. I believe it's very important. Before you asked what strategies, I think a strategy is very important to question who provide these funds to authoritarian actors who are repressing. And I believe that NGOs also can integrate in their coalitions and organizations that they work with on this issue, because this is an effective way to guarantee that there are no so much repression in Guatemala. Since the pandemic, the state has become totally opaque and the press starts to ask for information and the information doesn't arrive. And this should be a requisite for financing, so that there's a transparent information that goes to the citizens.
Thanks, Evelyn. Farouk, what's your take?
I think the stakeholders of the financial institutions, international financial institutions, who are known to be human rights defenders around the world, and they raise the human rights flag all the time, have a big role to bring questions to the table and make the financial institutions more transparent and more obligatory towards human development, human rights framework. So that's number one. It's very important for those countries to be more vocal around the table. The second one is that though it's a multilateral organizations, but civil society is part of the citizenship, the people that live on those countries. So civil society must have space on the World Bank meetings and in other cases, when we ask questions, we expect that the International Financial Institute would have the obligation to answer those questions. It's not that you cannot, you would not answer the questions raised by the civil society or the people as a body. So I think these 2 points are very important, and we have to raise our voices, and we have to be united to claim our space in this institution's decision-making process.
Thanks, Farouk. Hannah, what's your take on this?
Thank you, Tabani and David. I think it's a great question. The governments are shareholders of these development banks, and they therefore have a lot of power within these institutions to make change, either by asking difficult questions, or they're part of the approval process of different projects. So they should be raising questions around press freedom, civic space at early stages of projects, particularly ones where there's a high risk of reprisals. I think that that's particularly true for those countries that have made commitments around press freedom and said that this is a priority for them in their foreign policy. It's really bringing together those commitments so that it's not just, you know, quite often the government representatives at the banks sit in finance departments, and the or ministries, and the people responsible for foreign affairs sit somewhere else. And actually we need them to be talking to each other, because if they're making commitments around press freedom with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they should be bringing that into their work with the banks as well. So a lot of it is just bringing together those two areas a little bit more effectively, and just using the process that already exists to be putting pressure on internally and raising these questions.
Thanks, Anna. I think the other question that is in the Q&A is what corrective measures will there be against governments carrying out reprisals against journalists and others in the context of COVID-19? If there can be a strong movement in that regard. Any actions? I think the panel is flowing well in responding as a sync. I'll start with Farouk.
Yeah, I think we have to fight, and we have to claim the space, the civic space, and our right to know, and our right to express ourselves. And especially during the COVID time, we have to be vocal and ask the government to inform us properly. Like, for example, in Bangladesh, we do not know any strategy of the government, if there is any strategy to address the COVID pandemic. Or when there is a lockdown, we don't know when the lockdown will start and when the lockdown will finish. So the information are not being shared. So this pressure has to be there. And also we need international support so that people who are vocal in these countries, in South Asia and in other countries where they have authoritarian governments, to protect them. So if the international eyes are on these countries, lots of people will be protected, and the government would not have this much authoritarian attitude. The whole attitude is very oppressive to the people and the people's health and life.
Thanks, Farouk. Hannah, your take on this.
Yeah, thanks. So in terms of, from the bank's perspective, what they might do, I think one thing to say is the importance of trying to prevent rather than just responding. So I just want to flag that straight off the bat, that we're really pushing them to think about preventing this. So early on, really communicating their policies around zero tolerance of reprisals, maybe having contractual obligations around reporting accusations of reprisals, that sort of thing. And then when a reprisal does occur, having a plan in place to respond to that reprisal effectively and quickly. And, you know, it may be that a project needs to be finished if these situations continue, but really what we want the banks to do is be speaking to the government, is to be really using their leverage to say that this isn't acceptable, that it needs to be stopped, and that they need to take further action to investigate, to ensure that human rights defenders, journalists and healthcare workers are safe.
Thanks, Anna. Then Evelyn, what's your take on this one?
No me cabe duda que debe haber una mayor planificación.
Of course, there's no doubt. There has to be more strategic planification from the development banks, because freedom of expression is mixed with other issues that have to be shared with development banks. Transparency and governance. There are many doctors, for example, many frontline workers who claimed lack of protection in the first days of the pandemic. One of the doctors leading this denounce passed away from COVID-19. So if there's a strategic planification, we could see what actions or sanctions could be applied on the countries who are not meeting their compromises towards new fundings or the fundings already in place. Because of course the development bank should be monitoring these actions somehow.
Thanks very much, Evelyn. And as we were discussing, we highlighted that if you are interested in joining advocacy campaigns on the next steps on this report, please get in touch with Hannah. And the email has been dropped into the chat box. Please feel free to contact at any moment so that we can broaden the scope of this campaign. I think I don't see any other questions. So what I'll request is for the panelists to take their last round in a minute each in response or in their conclusive remarks around whether the development banks are funding the pushback or fueling the pandemic. This one I will not dictate to who takes first, but all of you shall answer. Thank you.
Okay, I will take the opportunity. I think the next steps are very important for this campaign with the report. And also, as I mentioned, that we took Pakistan as a example, as a case story, but we also need to do the same kind of a letter. We need to write about Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and India as well. And it's not a problem of South Asia only, because Article 19 works internationally. So we know that in other countries, the same kind of problem exists. So it's very important that we are together and we don't stop at this point. Publishing report is not the end of the story. Publishing report is the beginning of a campaign. So I wish that we all join together and we continue this campaign. Thank you.
Thanks, Farouk. Before the other two panelists jump in, unfortunately, I have to take another urgent question that has emerged. I hear Eken wants to speak. His or her hand is up.
Okay. Thank you very much. I am Ekane. From Cameroon. I'm working with Green Development Advocates, which is a civil society organization in Cameroon, defending and protecting rights of local and indigenous communities. And GDA is coordinating a platform called International Financial Institutions Synergies Group, IFEX Synergy Group in Cameroon, which follow up on international financial investments in Cameroon. And this, the platform was created in 2015, and we are lucky. We have had we have been funded. We have had small grants from the Coalition for Human Rights in Development, which we are currently implementing. So, my question is, in 2000, Cameroon has enacted some of its laws, especially its terrorism law that they enacted in 2017. And with that, environmental rights defenders have been termed as enemies of the state, and this law is being used now to shut down defenders. And yeah, I've heard the presentations, and it's mostly focused on the banks, the World Bank, FMO, and the rest. My question is, when we interact with countries like China, with lots of investments in all over the world, and in Cameroon in particular, with no clear strategies on how defenders should defend rights of local communities. I would like to ask maybe the panelists to maybe throw light if they have ever engaged with China or in their various countries, or they had some strategies. They have some strategies on how they can interact or engage with Chinese investments in their countries, because it's difficult for us in Cameroon, since we don't see any clear cuts between how to engage with the Chinese investments in Cameroon.
Thanks, Akane. The question is noted. I'll allow my panelists to quickly take the question as the last question. Additional questions we can then engage via email or in other platforms, but a quick round of response. Farouk Yasef, I will not ask you to do conclusive remarks again, but a quick round of response on this one.
No, we keep an eye on China and China's investment in South Asia, but we have never got into engagement with Chinese government or authority or business yet. So I cannot answer this properly.
I can just
Evelyn?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to say it's a huge topic, and it's quite a complicated one to answer. You're indeed right that the working with Chinese actors is different and complicated. What I was going to suggest is that Akane, you email me and we have a follow-up discussion around this, because it's something that I don't think I can cover in a few minutes of chat, but it would be really good to carry on talking about it, and it is something that the campaign is keen to talk to others about as well. So if anyone else is interested, please do get in touch.
Great. Evelyn?
Bien, solo terminar diciendo que...
Yes, I would like to add. I'm not going to answer the last question only, but I would like to make a comment on the importance to remember constantly the responsibilities that they have, because they have the resources. So when we face authoritarian governments, obviously, we cannot demand from one day to the other that they act democratically and remind them that they are a tool for development. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. I think you have used the few minutes to do your conclusive remarks as well as respond to the question. Hannah? Any conclusive remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Just very quickly, I just wanted to say as a summary, we're really not asking the banks to do anything that goes beyond fulfilling commitments that they've already made. So we're not asking for a huge amount, but we're asking for them to take seriously those commitments and obligations that they already have. And I also just wanted to end by saying, if there's anybody on the line from banks or government shareholders, we really welcome an ongoing discussion on this and a more detailed discussion with you. So please do get in touch. We'll be reaching out. So yeah, thank you. This is the beginning, not the end.
Thanks very much, Hannah. I'm left with thanking firstly our panelists, Hannah, Farouk, and Evelyn, for doing justice to this rather complex issue that we are facing, but also to thank on behalf of the Coalition for Human Rights in Development, Article 19 and IFEX, for all the work towards coming up with this report that is geared towards checks and balances and accountability of the banks towards their funding on the pandemic. I also want to thank the participants for their active engagement, and that this must not end here, but that we have broken the ice. Let's take this advocacy work a notch higher, and it is solidarity that is the best shield when we are under attack, especially during these times of confinement. That will take our work to greater heights. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.